Hello, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours, where I upload videos of live Zoom creative workshops from my Healing Art Happy Hour meetups. I'm Shauna Robeson from Creating Space Coastal, and this is the fourth installment of a 5-part watercolor foundations workshop. In this video, I will be discussing how to create some easy and fun special effects that can easily take your watercolor projects to the next level. Watercolor painting combines chemical science, art, and a touch of magic. In this lesson, I will unveil some of the mystery behind the magic of how to get some really fun and exciting texture and effects in your watercolor paintings. Handouts for this slide presentation are available for download at my shop at creatingspacecoastal.com. And as always, happy creating!
All right, now special effects. These are some of the tools that I'm using to create some special effects. The first effect we're going to talk about is white space. You can either maintain the white space or try to bring it back. To maintain the white space, you can do that by masking, and you can use that with masking tape or masking fluid. There's actually a liquid that turns into kind of a rubbery substance once it's on. I do recommend, if you're, use a cheaper brush, something you don't care about because it can damage your brush, dip it in some liquid soap before you, and then, kind of don't have a lot of soap on it, just kind of wipe it off on the edge of the container for the soap, and then dip it in here first, and that'll protect your bristles. It'll make it easier to clean up later. And then you can just draw whatever you want with this liquid on your page, and it'll keep whatever you've drawn white, because you'll just peel that off later. And in the original class, I demonstrated this, and I'll be demonstrating those throughout next month. I'll be using that technique, so you'll get to see that then. But basically, you're just protecting the paper from anything getting on it, and then you remove that later on. It's just like basically you would do with tape. Now, I did try it with rubber cement too, and that worked. It's a little harder to control. It's a little thicker, gel more, and there's ways to thin it, but I haven't done it myself, and I don't want to recommend that until I've tried something. So, but it's a cheap way if you've already got rubber cement and you want to try it. Sometimes it tears the paper coming off, so just be real careful. Use an eraser to lift, just kind of rub the eraser over the top of it, and that's true for the masking fluid as well. Don't leave it on longer than you have to. So put it on, let it dry, and then do your painting. And then once you're done using that, once you no longer need it, remove it from the paper as soon as you can, just so it doesn't really set hard on the paper, because then sometimes it can, like I said, it's more likely to tear the paper or be harder to lift. So, and that's true of this as well, but rubber cement, it's not designed specifically for that, so it's even more likely to do that. And then a wax crayon creates more of a resist, where you can draw. You can use a candle or a wax-based pencil, but you basically draw on the page, and wherever that wax is on the page, it's going to resist any of the pigment, so you won't get any color there. Now, be aware that you can't then in the future add color there, because the wax is going to stay there, so it's not as effective. If you want to maybe add some color, you maybe want lighter color there. If you really want to keep it white, then you can use this technique. Just be aware that it's going to be permanent. The next thing is to try to bring the color back. You can do that by lifting. So if this is wet, I can take a tissue, try to lift that paint, or I can try scrubbing it. Now, I do find that for this paper that I'm using, it can't handle the scrubbers, because the paper starts to break up. But this works fine for cotton. You can do a lot better, or your paper might be better than mine. So you can try scrub brushes. They actually are designed specifically for scrubbing and lifting. You can also use a clean brush, just a normal brush, just to lift up paint as well. And then you can also do scraping. Now, I cut up an old credit card into 3 sections. So I have the corners where I cut it. I also have the smooth corner of the card, how it was in the beginning. And I use that like a palette knife. So I'll be demonstrating that throughout this month as well. And then you can also use this to do scratching. That basically scratches away the paint and gets to the white below. So those are some fun techniques to bring some whiteness back to your painting. And here's some examples of that. So this is the dry brush effect that I talked about before, where I don't have a lot of pigment on my brush, and I did a stroke and it just lets some of the paint get down, but there's a lot of white space. This is using the credit card to move pigment and create these shapes of these mountains. I just started with laying a wash, and then I just created this shape. And then I probably added a little more pigment on top of that, but you can see it creates these interesting mountain shapes. And then I took the edge or the corner of that credit card and I did this scratching. And in this case, it actually kept that pigment in there and made it darker. So it did the opposite effect. Whereas this, it actually went down to the paper. You can see where I brought the white back. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the other chemical type effects shortly, like the salt, but this is an example of what that looks like. And then again, doing the scraping with the credit cards, that brought back some white there. This is using a cork with tissue to lift it while it's wet. Sometimes you can, once it's dry, you can re-wet it and then lift. So it doesn't always have to happen right away when it's dry. But you can get, but this particular one I did use while it was still wet. I didn't let it dry first. Okay. And then you can also add it by adding either something that's opaque, like a gouache white, or even watercolor that's white does have some opacity. Typically, because it's got, I think part of the minerals that make it white are chalky. And so you do get some opacity. So here you can see these splatters that are a little bit transparent. Those are just watercolor paint that I splattered on there. And then I also used a gel pen to add some white stars that are a little bit more vibrant. And I also used the white gel pen to add the snow. So there's ways to definitely get some white back with, you can also use acrylic paint. It acts like the gouache. It would be more opaque. All right, so for texture, as I mentioned, and I showed that picture of the salt, I'm going to be talking about that shortly, but there's some other, and this is a lot easier if I could show, but basically, if I have a pretty wet, juicy layer of paint down with lots of pigment on my paper, I can just over the top of that lay down some wax paper. Now you can crinkle it up first, or you can just lay it down flat, and it's going to create some texture as it dries. You just leave it on there until it completely dries, and then it'll start lifting almost. It'll be suctioned to the paper a little bit, and as it dries, it'll sort of release that. And then you can do that with bubble wrap or plastic wrap as well. You just basically have a pretty wet, juicy, colorful paper, and then you just lay these on top and let it dry. And then you get some really interesting textures. For example, and I think I have some samples of that shortly. You can also use chemistry. Either alcohol will move the pigment away from, it'll kind of make the pigment move away from where the alcohol was, and water does the same thing. So you get those blooms. So you can actually intentionally sprinkle some of that or spray it on afterwards to get that effect. And then salt is a little tricky because you want it just wet enough, but not too wet to just dissolve the salt. But the salt will basically move the pigment as well. It kind of sucks up pigment and color and creates these little star-shaped white spaces. And that's what I had showed in that picture. And I think I have another example too. But so you apply it just before or after the shine is gone. So wet the paper, make sure it's real wet, and then keep an eye on the shininess of it. Make sure there's not pools of water. And then once it just loses its shine, or right before that, just sprinkle the salt on there. And the bigger the salt chunks, the more water it can handle. So if you have a really wet page and you lay these big rocky salts things on there, they're probably going to be fine. But if you laid this table salt on there, it would just dissolve and you wouldn't get as good of effect. So just be aware that the effect and the wetness is affected by the size of the salt crystals. So try it with different sizes, even rock salt. Some people on bigger projects where they want, bigger effects, they use rock salt. You can also splash and spatter and flick paint or pigment on there with a paintbrush or a toothbrush. You just tap a paintbrush on your finger, make sure it's really, really wet and with full of pigment, some dark pigment or light pigment. I use it with white or dark colors typically, or some accent color depending on what the page is. And then you just tap it on your finger and it'll splatter the page and get some interesting little splatter effects. So that's fun. And then here are some examples of this is using masking tape. I tore different shaped tapes and I just ran them on there to keep that really white because I wanted those trunks to be really white. I also used here the splatter effect to look like leaves on there. I used the masking fluid to keep these whites so I could do some washes without having to worry about losing those bright colors there. The wax paper creates these interesting textures that I created here just by, like I said, just laying it on the page and letting it dry while it was really wet. And I also use that here to create these interesting textures. It's not creating these lines I build in, but this basic texture that's down there is all just from the effects of the wax paper.
Shauna, did you say you laid the wax paper there and left it until it dried?
Yes, don't touch it until it dries.
Okay.
Yeah, I just put a bunch of pigment down while it was nice and wet and juicy. I laid the wax paper and walk away. And it takes a long time to dry because it's under the wax paper. So just be patient. And then you can also do stamp effects with watercolor. So you can dip anything textured into the paint and then onto your page and get some interesting effects that way. And you can look around your house and see what has texture that you want to try and play around with that. So you can find some interesting, unique textures by looking around.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Healing Art After Hours. You can download materials related to this topic, including PDF notes of PowerPoint presentations, at creatingspacecoastal.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you found this content helpful, and join me for the next video here at my Creating Space Coastal channel, where I hope to inspire you to create space in your life for fun. Thank you.